That's it. Right.
Right here.
Sure. Good.
So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Tushita. So it's Lhabab Duchen is one of the 4 big Buddhist holidays. And you know what it all means? Maybe you can ask Lena later on. He's the teacher. Here we go. Delegated. So we have an all-day program, and we're very happy that Glenn Svensson, accepted to give a teaching. Although he's very busy, he just led our previous intermediate course and will teach the next introductory course, our last course of the season. So we are very happy that Glenn said yes. Thank you so much. And so this teaching will be around 1.5 hours and probably also connected with question and answers. And we are also live streaming it on YouTube, and it's on Zoom. So in the future, also, if you can't come to Tushita, please be aware that events like this, we always make hybrid nowadays. Yeah, that's the big thing, hybrid. So we put everything also on Zoom. Yeah, thank you so much. And then after the session, there will be a medicine Buddha puja from 5 to 6-ish and light offerings from 7 o'clock. Thank you so much and enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome here to Tushita, and welcome to this talk titled How to Cultivate Mental Balance and Wellbeing. So let's dive straight in. And the talk is going to be based on an article titled Mental Balance and Wellbeing, Building Bridges Between Buddhism and Western Psychology, an article written by a well-known Buddhist, Alan Wallace, and a well-known psychologist, Shauna Shapiro. And here in the article, right at the beginning, it says, to help open up collaborative dialogue between Buddhism and Western psychology, this article introduces a 4-fold model of well-being, drawing from Buddhist teachings as well as Western psychology and research. And so this article then brings up this 4-fold model of well-being. It talks about 4 types of mental balance that we are to cultivate if we want to find this state of mental balance and well-being. And of course, the first question is, well, what do we mean by well-being? And here the article says, the goal of Buddhist practice is the realization of a state of well-being that is not contingent on the presence of pleasurable stimuli, either external or internal. In this article, the well-being we are referring to is fundamentally different from hedonic well-being, which includes stimulus-driven pleasures of all kinds. So here, when we talk about well-being, we can talk about 2 types of well-being. The first one is what we know as pleasure, or as stimulus-driven, meaning we have some sort of stimulus, we have a pleasant experience. But here in the article, when they talk about well-being, they're really focusing on the second one, contingent on any particular stimulus being present. And so here the article says, below we present a heuristic model that proposes that well-being arises from a mind that is balanced in 4 ways: cognitively, attentionally, cognitively, and affectively. So what we're going to focus on in this talk is first introduce the 4 types of mental balance that are described in this article. And then we'll look at each of the 4 types of mental balance. And the article describes how we are now imbalanced in each of those areas and then also suggests how to find balance in each one of those 4 areas. And then also the article goes on to talk about the importance of having an integrated approach, that if we really want to strive for genuine happiness and inner well-being, we need to cover all 4 bases. If we're not focusing on every one of those 4, then we won't really achieve the goal of well-being, inner well-being. And then I'd like to talk about one type of cognitive imbalance that really causes us a lot of suffering in our modern world, called cognitive fusion. And so we'll be looking at that towards the end of the talk. First, defining the 4 types of mental balance. So here, cognitive balance, I use the word motivational balance because conation or cognitive balance is not really a commonly used word. And so here the article says that cognitive or motivational balance is a reality-based range of desires and aspirations oriented towards one's own and others' happiness. So this is a starting point. If we don't have some reality-based aspirations for happiness, then we're really not going in the right direction. And we'll see how now we tend to go in the wrong direction in the search for happiness. And then the second one is attentional balance. And here it says, this is the ability to sustain a voluntary flow of attention with a quality of awareness that is suffused by ease, focus, and clarity. The third one, cognitive balance, the article says, entails engaging with the world of experience without imposing assumptions or ideas on events and thereby misapprehending or distorting them. So cognitive balance is all about seeing reality as it is, not projecting and distorting what we apprehend. And then the last one, affective balance. And again, affective is not a commonly used word, more used in psychology. And so here I prefer to use the word emotional balance. And so here it says, this entails a freedom from excessive emotional vacillation, emotional apathy, and inappropriate emotions. So they're the 4 types of mental balance that we're going to look at. And here the article in the beginning says, the model is presented in a linear fashion, beginning with cognitive balance. And it says, cognitive balance precedes the other 3 in the process of cultivating mental well-being, because this factor is what allows people to set intentions, goals, and priorities. In fact, cognitive processes set the course for the cultivation of the other 3 mental balances. So if we don't get this one right, then all the other 3 are heading in the wrong direction. And so then it says attentional balance is the next mental factor discussed, because attention is a necessary skill for achieving the final 2 factors, cognitive and affective balance. Without the ability to sustain attention, it is difficult to closely examine people's moment-to-moment cognitive and affective processes. So again, without attentional balance, it would be very difficult to cultivate cognitive or emotional balance because we don't have those attention skills. And then it says cognitive and affective balance are presented subsequently as they can most effectively be achieved on the basis of the prior cultivation of cognitive and attentional balance. And so we end up with this model here that first we have as a foundation the cognitive or motivational balance. On that basis, we attend to attentional balance. And having on the basis of attentional balance, we can engage effectively in the other 2 areas of mental balance of cognitive and emotional. And those of you who are already doing some sort of Buddhist practice, then the correlations are that the motivational cognitive balance would be sort of overlapping with what we know as preliminary practices in Buddhism. The attentional balance is shamatha practice. The cognitive balance would be vipassana practice, and the emotional balance would be compassion practice. So that's the correlations here between these 4 types of mental balance and various areas of Buddhist practice. And in this article, it introduces this sort of 3 types of imbalance that can exist in each of these areas. And here, the says below, we describe each of the four mental balances. In an attempt to precisely operationalize them, we use a system of classification drawn from traditional Tibetan medicine, which defines physiological imbalances in terms of deficit, hyperactivity, and dysfunction. This system of classification is closely linked to Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. So what we're going to do is have a look at, in each of these four types of mental balance, there are three types of imbalances. Deficit, meaning not enough; hyperactivity, too much; and dysfunction, wrong type. And so we'll see how in each of those areas we can have those three types of imbalance. And then the article goes on to propose how to correct each one of those three types of imbalance in each of those four areas. So that's what we're going to look at. So we'll start with motivational or cognitive balance. And so here, again, the article says cognitive balance is the first of the mental states discussed because of its central importance to all other mental states. If one does not develop cognitive balance, i.e., a reality-based range of desires and aspirations, or happiness, then there will be little or no incentive to try to balance one's attentional, cognitive, and affective faculties. So if we don't get this one right, then we'll probably have no incentive to work in the other three areas. And even if we do, we'll be probably going astray. So let's have a look at this first one, how we can be imbalanced. So a motivational deficit or a cognitive deficit, the article says, occurs when people experience an apathetic loss of motivation for happiness and its causes. And we often tend to have this lack of aspiration for happiness, either because we don't feel like we can achieve happiness, or there is actually no such thing as genuine happiness. And then hyperactivity, it says, is present when people fixate on obsessive goals that obscure the reality of the present. People are so caught up in craving and fantasies about the future, about their unfulfilled desires, that their senses are dulled as to what is happening here and now. So hyperactivity is this obsessive focus on the future and not attending to what's in front of us right now. And then dysfunction, it says, finally, cognitive dysfunction sets in when people desire things that are detrimental to their own and others' well-being and are indifferent to things that do contribute to their own and others' well-being. And so here, I think many of us in the modern world have this cognitive dysfunction. And this is very much highlighted here by this great Indian master, Shanti Deva, in the 8th century, who says, those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery. And with the very desire for happiness, out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy. And so again, I think most of us in the modern world desire happiness and to be free of suffering. But it seems like no matter what we do, we still encounter suffering and we're not finding that happiness. And here, what the article is saying is that it's because we don't have this motivational balance. Our desires and aspirations for happiness are not reality-based. They're going astray. So how do we overcome these motivational imbalances? So deficit, meaning a loss of desire for happiness. How do we overcome that? The article says, remedy apathy by meditating on the realities of impermanence and suffering and the possibility of generating well-being by reflecting, for example, on the lives of those who have realized such fulfillment. And so often when we're stuck in a lot of heavy suffering, we sort of feel stuck, you know, as if this is going to go on forever. But here it's saying, if we just, and this used to do many years ago, even before being a Buddhist, if I was stuck in a sort of negative state that seemed to be ongoing, I would just think, this too shall pass. And so already that made it lighter. So that's impermanence, this too shall pass. And then reflecting on seeing those around us who really have managed to get out of suffering significantly and are moving towards happiness, to inspire us that if they can do it, so can I, so that we can have an aspiration for happiness. And then hyperactivity here, it says, remedy obsessive desire with the cultivation of contentment by reflecting on the transitory, unsatisfactory nature hedonic pleasures. So we're caught up in a lot of this hyperactivity by chasing after sensory pleasures, hoping and trying to hold on to them, hoping that they're really going to satisfy us. So here it's suggesting to cultivate this contentment, understanding that these sensory pleasures, they're transient, they're temporary, they're never really going to fulfill us, giving any lasting happiness. But at the deepest level, if we really want motivational balance, we need to do the third one. That is, remedy mistaken goals with the experiential recognition of the true causes of both suffering and well-being. To really reflect on, where is the source of my suffering? Where is the source of my inner well-being coming from? And so here we find that often for many of us in the modern world, we tend to be looking out there for the source of our suffering and the source of our happiness. And it's with that perspective, it's really our perspective, it's all about what happens to us. And then we tend to equate pleasure with happiness, and we tend to equate pain with suffering. And so this perspective is then really all about what we can get from the world. Let's get as much pleasure and try to avoid as much unpleasant as possible. And then we simply end up with attachment to pleasure, and we end up with aversion to pain. And we tend to see then difficult situations as problems, because difficult situations, unpleasant, don't want them, they're a big problem, and we just have aversion. And with this perspective, then no matter how much we chase after pleasure, no matter how much we try and avoid painful experiences, we're just going to have more suffering. We're never going to find the solution. Whereas if we really reflect, where is the source of my suffering and happiness, we can come to appreciate that it lies within our own mind, meaning that it's not so much about what happens to us, but it's more about how we respond to what happens to us. Because we can't control what happens to us. And if our happiness is predicated on what happens to us, we're doomed, because we never can control the things around us. Fortunately, we don't have to control the things around us to overcome suffering and find happiness, because the source is not out there. If we really reflect, we'll see it's within ourselves. And then we'll really see pleasure is not the same as happiness. Pain is not the same as suffering. It's actually our attachment to pleasure and our aversion to pain that causes suffering. And here's a nice quote I like: painful experiences. But it's in our control whether or not we turn that into suffering, whether or not we react to that or not. So this view, it's more not about what we can get from the world, it's more about what we can bring to the world. So instead of reacting with attachment aversion, this really predicates responding with loving kindness and compassion. And here we'll see difficult situations as opportunities, because we know well from our own experience, the times where we most developed as a person was not when things were going well. We just sort of float along and not really develop. It's only when we're challenged do we develop. So actually difficult situations are opportunities for us to develop. And so if we can really reflect like this, as the article says, we can come to an experiential recognition of the true causes of both suffering and well-being. They lie within ourselves. But as long as we have a mind with mental afflictions like attachment, aversion, jealousy, hatred, and so forth, then we're going to suffer. But if we can eliminate those, then we can really overcome suffering and find that well-being in this text, in this article rather. And so then it says then at the end of this motivational balance, it says the result of such cognitive balance is a decrease in interest in achieving an excess of things such as sensual pleasures, material acquisitions, and social status. So we're going to lose interest in chasing after those things, because we'll see they're never going to bring us happiness. And if we have craving and attachment for them, we're just going to suffer. and then a growing commitment to leading a meaningful and deeply satisfying life, qualified by a growing sense of well-being, understanding, and virtue. And so this is how we can achieve this motivational balance, this reality-based desires and intentions, striving for our own happiness and happiness of others. And so then on that basis, the second one mentioned in the article is attentional balance. And here it says, the article says, attentional balance is the next factor discussed because attention is a necessary skill for achieving the final two factors, cognitive and affective balance. Without the ability to sustain attention, it is difficult to closely examine people's moment-to-moment cognitive and affective processes. And those of you who are doing already some sort of Buddhist practice know this well, but actually if we look at a lot of Buddhist traditions in the world today, there is quite a lot of mention about the first one, and there's a lot of practice and mention about the last two, but the second one sort of gets left out a little bit. And so then the whole core of what we're doing in Buddhist practice, it doesn't really work, because without attention skills, all the other two main areas we see here in Buddhism would be the Vipassana and the compassion practices won't be effective. And this is what the article is also saying here. So let's have a look at this attentional balance. Firstly, the three types of imbalance in this area of mental balance. So deficit, meaning not enough, it says attentional deficit is characterized by the inability to focus vividly on the chosen object. So that's when we're trying to focus and our mind is sinking and we can't really see the object very clearly. Mind is getting very dull and drowsy. In the technical word in the text is laxity, mind is sinking. Then hyperactivity, it says, occurs when the mind is excessively aroused, resulting in compulsive distraction and agitation, or sometimes called excitation. And then dysfunction, it says, attention is dysfunctional when people focus on things in afflictive ways, those that are not conducive to our own and others' well-being. And this dysfunctional way of attending actually is largely addressed in the other three areas of motivational, cognitive, and emotional. So here we're focusing really on the first two, the sinking, the laxity, the agitation, distraction, the excitation. So then how do we overcome these two imbalances of laxity and excitation? And here the article says these imbalances are remedied through the cultivation of mindfulness, which is defined in many Buddhist texts as sustained voluntary attention, continuously focused on a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. And the second one here, it says meta attention. This is a psychological word, used in psychology a lot. The ability to monitor the state of the mind, swiftly recognizing whether one's attention has succumbed to either excitation or laxity. So to overcome these two balances, we first need mindfulness. And here this diagram, the classic diagram in Buddhist shamatha practice, we see the meditator, and in the left hand they have a rope, in the right hand a hook. So the rope is symbolizing this mindfulness. And the elephant is the mind. We see that it's running wildly ahead of the meditator. So when we try to attend to an object, we see that our mind is completely out of control. And then we have to hold the object with mindfulness. So we have to tie the mind with a rope to the object. So that's the rope of mindfulness. But then we need to monitor that. And that is meta attention, or in Buddhism often called introspection. It's like quality control, because we're holding with mindfulness, but we need to monitor that. We need to notice, are we still holding the object, or are we starting to sink? Mind is getting dull, or are we getting agitated and distracted? So that's introspection's job. And that's the hook, to hook our mind back when we notice we've become dull or distracted. So these are the two tools we use to help us to overcome these two attentional imbalances. And so here then, it says, the article goes on to say, when laxity sets in, that is when mind starts to sink, the primary remedy is to arouse the attention by taking a fresh interest in the object of meditation. Because very often in this practice, the reason our mind is sinking, getting very dull, is we just lost interest in the practice. So the first thing is to refresh our interest in the practice. Then we can restore our attention on the object and then really retain that flow of mindfulness on the object. Whereas here it says, whereas when the mind becomes agitated, the first thing to do is to relax more deeply. Because very often, particularly in the modern world, the reason our mind starts to get agitated in this practice is we're too tight, we're pushing too hard. And unfortunately, that's our habit in the modern world, this striving mind, pushing mind. We want to achieve. And so generally in our lives, when we're engaging in some task, we really push hard and our mind gets very tight. So this is not a really sustainable way of focus. And so here is much emphasis on relaxation, that if we really want to develop any sustainable attention skills, we first need to relax. So if we notice any agitation, tension, or distraction, the first thing to do is to relax. And in the article, in this way, the attentional imbalances of laxity and excitation may be overcome. But then the article goes on to say, well, what object should we focus on to develop this attentional balance? And the article says, one of the most widespread Buddhist practices for developing attentional balance is mindfulness of breathing. And we see that in many Buddhist traditions. They really emphasize mindfulness of breathing. And often also in a lot of more modern day mindfulness traditions, they also emphasize mindfulness of breathing. And I think one of the reasons is it's very suitable for us in the modern world, because many of us in the modern world are caught up in obsessive compulsive thinking. Our mind is going around and round all day long, and it torments us. And so by focusing on the breath, we get out of our obsessive compulsive thinking mind and we get into the body. Good move. And the breath, the sensations of breath only happen in the present moment. And most of our compulsive, obsessive thinking is we're going off into the past, jumping off into the future. And according to Buddhism and modern studies now, living in the past and future is just the source of a lot of unhappiness. If we can get in the present moment, we can let go of a lot of that. So mindfulness of breathing is perfect for us in the modern world. Get out of the blah, blah, blah mind into the present moment. And it says here, in such practice, one may begin by focusing the attention on the tactile sensations of the respiration wherever they arise in the entire body. So when we begin this, easy way to get in, just notice any sensations in the body connected with the breathing. Very easy. Start there. Then it says, then one may then more narrowly focus on the sensations of the rise and fall of the abdomen with each in and out breath. So then narrow down a bit to abdomen. Many Buddhist traditions focus there. And then it says, in the most highly focused exercise, the attention may be directed to the sensations of the passage of the breath at the apertures of the nostrils. So then we can move to here. For many of us in the modern world, I think if we start this sort of practice, if we go directly here, problem. Because it's not so easy to focus here. And if we come into the practice with this sort of striving, pushing, tight mind, and then we focus here, we'll just clamp down harder, we'll get even more agitated, we'll get exhausted, may even get headaches from meditating. So for most of us, not a good idea to start here. Start full body, start down. Then later, when you're more relaxed, move here. And this is what it says here in the article. It says, in Buddhist attentional practice, one first emphasizes the cultivation of mental and physical relaxation. Key. If we don't have a relaxed body and mind, if we push hard, we're going to unravel in our practice. We'll really not get anywhere. And on that basis, attentional stability is highlighted. And finally, one focus on the development of attentional vividness. So I can't overemphasize this point enough from my own experience and talking to many people who begin this sort of practice, attentional balance or shamatha practice. Really relax, 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 relax. Without a relaxed body and mind, you'll find this practice extremely difficult, and you're just building up bad habits of pushing tight tension. So we're trying to overcome that. And then it says, then at the end of this section, it says the result of such training is a state of attentional balance in which a high level of attentional arousal is maintained. So we're completely alert and focused while remaining deeply relaxed and composed. That's something new for us in the modern world. In the modern world, we tend to oscillate between two extremes. Either we're alert and focused, but then tense. And then when we relax, we're sort of half asleep. So we're either alert and tense or relaxed and dull. So we're trying to combine relaxation and being alert. And for many of us in the modern world, that's something completely new. But that's really the sustainable way of focus, not only here, but actually in everything we do in our life. Because we know well now, if we're alert and focused and tense at work all day long, what happens at the end of the day? We're completely exhausted and often very agitated. So this is, and then of course we end up with a lot of physical problems because of that. We can't sleep well, and we just keep doing that because we don't know anything else, because we think, well, if we relax, we just get sort of drowsy, we can't focus at work. But if we combine the two, and we can do that in this training, then we can bring this into daily life, at work, everything we do. We can be much more relaxed and still be alert, much more effective, much less fatigue, and much more joyful in everything we do. So here it says, for this reason, it is called meditative quiescence, which here is a translation of the Sanskrit word shamatha, which literally means a calm, focused mind. And then it says the mind is now free of both attentional laxity and excitation, and it can be used effectively for any task to which it is put. So not only now do we have a good basis for cultivating cognitive and emotional balance, but anything we do in our life, we have a very good basis now. We can be very relaxed, very alert, very attentive, very effective in everything we do in our life. So then the third of the four types of mental balance that are talked about here is cognitive balance. And here the article says cognitive balance entails engaging with the world of experience without imposing conceptual assumptions or ideas, and thereby misapprehending or distorting them. It therefore involves being calmly and clearly present with experience as it arises moment by moment. So here, cognitive balance is really about seeing reality as it is and not projecting or distorting what we apprehend. Because it's our projecting and distorting what we apprehend that really leads to mental afflictions and suffering. So let's have a look at how we are now imbalanced in these three ways in this area. So cognitive deficit, the article says, at times people are simply absent-minded, meaning we're not actually seeing. On other occasions, they get caught up in their assumptions and expectations, failing to distinguish between perceived realities and their fantasies. So we're projecting a lot of stuff on top of reality and making up some fantasy world that's not actually there. And then dysfunction, it says, and they are generally prone to misapprehending events in a myriad of ways due to cognitive deficit and hyperactivity imbalances. And so in this area, in Buddhist texts, they often use the example of the snake and the rope. And the analogy is that we're walking along a path and it's quite dark. And then on the side of the path, we see something coiled up on the ground. And because we can't see clearly, we think, oh, there's a snake there. We have fear and we run away. But then if we come back later with a flashlight or a torch, we shine light on it, we see, well, actually, there's no snake there at all. So likewise, now we project things onto reality, but and that causes things like fear and mental afflictions and suffering. But then if we come and shine the light of wisdom, we see reality as it is, then no problem. So here, let's have a look at how to overcome each of those three. And says, in terms of overcoming these imbalances, the article says, according to Buddhism, the distinguishing characteristic of what we are referring to as cognitive balance is that one views the world without the imbalances of cognitive hyperactivity, deficit, or dysfunction. Overcoming such cognitive imbalances is a central theme in Buddhist practice, where one of the primary interventions is the application of discerning mindfulness to whatever arises from moment to moment. And here it's talking about now mindfulness, because we talked about mindfulness in attention training, and here we're also using mindfulness, but we're using mindfulness in a different way. And it says here, the faculty of mindfulness, as previously defined, is initially cultivated as a means to overcome attentional balances, and then it is then applied to daily experience in order to achieve cognitive balance. So we are cultivating mindfulness, strengthening our mindfulness in attentional balance training or shamatha practice, and now we apply that mindfulness to gain cognitive balance, to investigate nature of reality in vipassana practice. And how we do this is the classic way we find in Buddhist texts, what's called the 4 applications of mindfulness. And we're investigating 4 things. We investigate the body, feelings, mental states or mind, and mental states in process, or just mind in general, and phenomena in general. So we investigate our fundamental system of meditative practice in Buddhism for achieving insight by means of overcoming cognitive imbalances. And so we see this particularly in the Theravada Buddhist traditions, these 4 applications of mindfulness. The classic text, the Satipatthana Sutra, is all about this. And so there are a number of cognitive imbalances here that we see in Buddhist texts. The very first one we often see is now we see things which are changing as unchanging. I mean, we know well, and science has proven it, that everything we see is changing moment by moment, you know, at the atomic level. But that's not how things appear to us. They appear sort of quite static and stable. And that's how we relate to them, as actually unchanging. And so that's a distortion, that's a projection. Similarly, we tend to see pleasure as happiness, and we see where there is no autonomous self, a self, there seems to be an autonomous self here, and there isn't. And then we see things which are dependent as independent, that everything's interdependent. But that's not how things appear to us, and we project that there is an independent me, independent world there. But if we apply mindfulness to these 4 things, we can come to 4 insights to overcome those imbalances. We can come to an insight into impermanence, experientially, that everything's changing moment by moment. We can come to an insight into suffering, that there's no genuine happiness to be found out there. We can come to an insight, there's no autonomous self to be found here. And we can come to this insight, what's called emptiness, that everything is interdependent. And this is really how we achieve this cognitive balance in this area. And so that's what it says here in the end of this part of the article. It says, by means of such close attentiveness to one's interactive presence with other people and the environment at large, problems of cognitive deficit are overcome, means we're seeing things very clearly. And by carefully observing what is perceptually presented to one's senses, one learns to distinguish between the contents of perception and the conceptual superimpositions that one projects onto one's immediate experience of the world. So we come to see things how they are, and we come to see how we are projecting a lot of things on top of reality that are simply not there. We can strip away. This cognitive balance is about stripping away those false ideas that we're superimposing on top of reality, that this is actually stable, that it's not really changing, and that there is an autonomous self here, and that there is an independent me, independent world there. We can strip away that by doing these applications of mindfulness to come to see reality as it is, and thereby achieve this cognitive balance. And then we come to the fourth of the four mental balances, emotional balance, or here it's called cognitive or affective balance, sorry. And it says affective balance entails a freedom from excessive emotional vacillation, emotional apathy, and inappropriate emotion. So let's again see how we can be imbalanced in these three ways in this area. First, deficit is an affective deficit disorder, has the symptoms of emotional deadness within and a sense of cold indifference toward others. So we often end up there because we are getting overwhelmed by certain stimulus or other people. And so we don't know how to deal with that. So we just cut. We just sort of cut from everything. And then we end up with this cold indifference or apathy towards everything, because we use that as a coping mechanism when we get overwhelmed. But again, this is not healthy. So we're going from probably hyperactivity to deficit. And so hyperactivity, it says, is characterized by excessive elation and depression, hope and fear, adulation and contempt, and infatuation and aversion. So this hyperactivity, reacting to things, again, at some point, it just overwhelms us so much, we just cut and we end up in deficit. We just cut from everything as a coping mechanism. And then dysfunction, it says affective dysfunction occurs when people's emotions are inappropriate to the circumstances at hand. For example, taking delight in someone else's misfortune or being disgruntled at others' success. So let's have a look what the article says about how to overcome these three types of imbalance. And here it says, Buddhism treats affective imbalances with many specific methods for countering such mental afflictions as craving, hostility, delusion, arrogance, and envy. And so if we want to counter these mental afflictions, like anger and attachment, jealousy, frustration, anxiety, and so forth, then the first thing is to have a clear understanding of the mental affliction we're dealing with. Because if we don't, then, for example, we might think, oh, actually, attachment's a good thing. It seems to give me some happiness, so I'm just going to keep doing it. But actually, if we look at attachment closely, we'll see that it just interferes with our enjoyment of pleasures and it just causes suffering. So the first step is to really understand that all of these mental afflictions are really just the cause of suffering, to develop the aspiration to get rid of them. Then I think the second point, which goes back to the earlier point of the motivational balance, is cultivate this view of genuine happiness. That is, as long as we see or believe that the source of our happiness and suffering is out there, then it's whenever we get something, see something pleasurable, attachment will follow. See something unpleasant, aversion, anger, hatred will follow. So as long as we have no motivational balance, then we won't be able to achieve emotional balance. We'll just keep reacting. And that's what we saw at the beginning of the article. It says that without that motivational balance, you won't be able to cultivate these others. And then how to actually counter mental afflictions if they're arising. So now, if these mental afflictions start to come up in our mind, what should we do? I mean, now we tend to either just get caught up in them or we try and suppress them. But that's not effective. I mean, neither of those is working. So the middle way between just getting caught up and trying to suppress is just step back and watch them. Because if we can step back and watch them, we're actually free of them. Then we don't have to fight with them. They got no power. Because actually mental afflictions from their own side have no power. They only have power to harm us if we give them power. And we give them power by either getting caught up in them or trying to suppress them. Then they have a lot of power to harm us. But if we can just step back and watch, they can't do anything. We don't need to fight with them. They'll just pass. Very good. So for that, we need attentional balance training, because without mindfulness, we're not going to be able to do that. Even if we want to, it's not going to happen. Because as soon as it comes up, we'll get caught up. As soon as it comes up, we'll try and suppress. So that's why we see also here, we need attentional balance if we want to deal with these mental afflictions here in emotional balance. And then we can also apply what's called specific antidotes. And a lot of that comes from the cognitive side. Like one antidote for anger is patience. Patience just means if there's a difficult situation, remain calm. Because if we can remain calm, it's harder to get angry. We can see more clearly what's going on, respond in a better way. And then impermanence, another good antidote, particularly for attachment. If we can really see that the thing I'm trying to grab with my attachment is just constantly changing, there's nothing for attachment to grab. So a good antidote for attachment. And at a deeper level, dependent arising, to see everything as interdependent, that everything comes through different factors. And if we can really see that, it's hard to react with these mental afflictions. So these are how we can counter mental afflictions. But then the article goes on to say as well, in addition, Buddhism presents a system of meditative practices designed to counter emotional imbalance by cultivating the qualities of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. So this is really, in Buddhism, the core of compassion practice, cultivating these four qualities of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. Loving kindness here is simply the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. Compassion is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering in its causes. And then empathetic joy is really a focusing on the positive aspects of ourselves and others. It's really a rejoicing in our own and others' virtues and good fortune. And equanimity is impartial, unbiased attitude. Now we tend to have attachment to friends because they seem to be the source of our happiness. We tend to have apathy to strangers because they don't seem to affect us in any way. And then we often have hostility, anger, hatred to difficult people because they seem to be the source of our suffering. And so equanimity here is all about overcoming these imbalances by understanding that we're all in the same situation. We all want to be happy. We all want to be free of suffering. We're all equal in this way. And so to get this sense of closeness to everyone, this impartial, unbiased attitude. And by cultivating these qualities, then again, instead of reacting to things out of attachment and aversion, we'll be able to start to respond with loving kindness and compassion, and thereby have this emotional balance. And so it says here as the result at the end of this section, it says, emotional balance is achieved when one has awareness of one's own and others' emotions, emotional triggers, and emotional behaviors as they arise, and making wise choices while engaging with emotional experience. So here, emotional balance, and this relates also to equanimity. Often people feel like when we're faced with things, we should just be blank, that this is equanimity, that this is a good thing. This is pathological. That's apathy, that's cutting. So here, emotional balance means to be fully present, fully engaged in our experiences, seeing them clearly and making wise choices, meaning responding with loving kindness and compassion rather than reacting with attachment and aversion and so forth. And then the article goes on to highlight the importance of having an integrated approach, because what we often find, and this also applies in many Buddhist traditions, is not all four get emphasized. For example, in in some of the Theravada traditions, you hear a lot about Vipassana practice. Yes, let's do Vipassana practice. But not much else of these others are mentioned. And so people put a lot of effort into Vipassana practice and don't really get anywhere, or even go sort of astray. And also in some Tibetan systems, they also talk a lot about emptiness practice. That's Vipassana. And also in Tibetan tradition, they also talk about bodhicitta, which is some compassion. But then the others, the preliminaries and shamatha, the other two somehow doesn't get talked much about. And so people try to do a lot of even compassion and Vipassana together, and they don't really get anywhere because they've got no foundation. Both the motivational and attentional balance are somehow missing. And they wonder why because they hear that the two main wings of practice is wisdom and compassion. I'm doing them, but I'm not getting anywhere. In fact, I'm having a lot of problems. Why is that? And often it's because these other two are largely missing. And so here the article says, although we present the model in a linear procession, we are not suggesting any kind of strict linearity among these four elements of mental balance. So it's not like first we do motivational balance. When we got that, tick, okay. Next, attentional. I'll do that. When I've got that, tick, okay, then I can do it. It's not going to work. So it says here, all components of the model are interconnected. The model represents a systemic and dynamic process of evolving toward well-being. Individual factors. It is important to note that as balance is gained in one area, it affects the other three. Meaning that if we want to achieve any of these four balances, we need help from the other three areas. So therefore, to really have an integrated approach to this practice, to cover all four bases. If we don't, we're going to be leaving ourselves short. So again, in the article earlier, it says, if one does not develop cognitive balance, i.e. the reality-based range of desires and aspirations oriented towards one's own and others' happiness, there will be little or no incentive to try to balance one's attentional, cognitive, affective faculties. Meaning that if we don't have this reality-based aspiration for happiness, then we're not going to be wanting to put all this effort into attentional, cognitive, emotional balance because we're too busy chasing after those sensory pleasures out there that seem to be bringing us happiness, too busy trying to avoid all those difficult situations that seem to give us suffering. And then even if we do try to practice this, then as Shanti Deva said, hasten right toward their own misery, and with the very desire for happiness, out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy. So there we see the first of those four elements is crucial for the other three to be effective. And then also in terms of attentional balance training, as the article said, is we need this to be able to practice cognitive and affective or emotional balance. Because if we don't have attentional balance, it's going to be very difficult to cultivate cognitive and emotional balance. Or from a Buddhist perspective, if we don't practice shamatha, single-pointed attention, then we can do Vipassana practice all day long and not get anywhere because our mind is distracted or very dull. And similarly, it's going to be very difficult to cultivate the positive qualities of loving kindness and compassion with a distracted or dull mind. And then, as we see actually in a lot of modern day mindfulness traditions, which they often grab that. So they're grabbing the sort of the attentional balance part, and then they look at those other three areas and go, oh no, that's that religious stuff. We don't want that. Let's get rid of that, you know. And they just pull out the attention, the mindfulness. And then they present that as like a magic pill. You practice a bit of mindfulness, everything will be resolved, everything will be fine. And it's not. In fact, it could make our life worse. Because if we've got a dysfunctional life, which involves a lot of deception and cheating people to make money, With mindfulness, we may get better at cheating and deceiving people, and then we're going to have even more problems in our life. And so this, someone coined this term McMindfulness, like McDonald's, fast food mindfulness, not very healthy. So we need some framework around mindfulness. We need these other three. We need motivational, cognitive, emotional balance. Then our mindfulness becomes very healthy. We need all four major food groups, not just junk food. And so here there's a quote from Alan Wallace, one of the authors of this article, in his book on this training. He says, there's a strong tendency to take our current way of life as the norm and then to add meditation to fix it, like a Band-Aid applied to a festering wound. And that's unfortunately what happens in a lot of these modern traditions. People have quite dysfunctional lives, and then they just add a bit of meditation, a bit of mindfulness to try and fix their life. And it's not very effective, and it could make it worse. And then if we don't practice cognitive and emotional balance, then you'll find your attentional balance is going to be difficult, because you're going to find a lot of these mental afflictions, which are dealt with effectively in cognitive balance, you'll find that they'll be very strong. So you'll be trying to do your attentional training, and a lot of mental afflictions will come up, which will cause agitation, distraction. So we need to subdue them a little bit while we're doing this training. And that's what cognitive training and emotional training does. So that's going to help. And then lastly, if we look at cognitive balance and emotional balance together, and unfortunately here, we often find that when people come into some sort of spiritual tradition, that they tend to gravitate to one of these two. Either they see, oh, wisdom, that's really the thing that's going to help me get out of suffering. Let's do a lot of wisdom, Vipassana practice. Or sometimes people just want to be kind and compassionate. They develop a good heart, but they sort of forget about the wisdom. And so if we only do one of the other and not both, we end up with a lot of problems. Because if we are trying to cultivate the cognitive balance, the wisdom side of things, and not working on the emotional balance, then often we can become very self-absorbed, very disconnected from the world, insensitive to the sufferings of others, and in very extreme cases become completely unethical, because thinking we've got some high level of wisdom now, so everything I do is okay, I can do whatever I want. And then if equally is this case, if we're just working on an emotional balance, developing a good heart, but not working on wisdom, then there's very much danger that our compassion practice can become very biased. You know, I'll help these people because they're nice people, they deserve my help. But these people over here, horrible, nasty people, I'm not going to help them. In fact, I hope they suffer. They deserve to suffer because they're horrible people. So we become very biased. And also without wisdom, with the best motivation in the world, sometimes we do things that don't help, that actually create more suffering because we don't know how to help. And then we can also end up with what's commonly referred to as compassion burnout, which is a classic case of compassion without wisdom. Classic case, because here the wisdom that can help us is the wisdom of knowing what we can do to help, what we can't do to help, the wisdom of knowing when to rest and look after ourselves. And then one last point, and I think all of us have experienced this many times, we try to help others and they take advantage of us. And we keep doing that and we suffer. And at some point we go, well, this compassion stuff doesn't work because I'm just suffering. And we give up compassion. Tragic. Compassion always works. What's not working here is there's a lack of wisdom. The wisdom is if we allow people to take advantage of us, that's not compassion, because in some ways we're encouraging them to behave badly and we're trying to help them to overcome their bad behavior as well. So the compassionate thing to do is not tolerate that negative behavior when we're trying to help them. If they're trying to take advantage, say, I will not tolerate that bad behavior. That's with wisdom. So then what we can see is that if we really want to be effective in striving for this genuine happiness and well-being, we need to cover all four bases: motivational, attentional, cognitive, emotion. If we cover all four, most effective, because each area is going to support the other three. And so it'll be much better to make progress if we cover those four bases. Any questions on any of those four before I go into this topic of this cognitive fusion that I mentioned earlier? Firstly, does anyone have any questions? Online, there's people online, there's a couple of questions here then. While, is it possible to share the details of the article? Yes, in fact, it's quite readily available on the internet. You just need to Google mental balance and wellbeing, Alan Wallace, and you'll find the article in a number of different sites. So that's easy. Okay, and then there's another question here, wondering whether deficit and hyperactivity is itself a dysfunction. Yeah, you could say it's a dysfunction as well, deficit and hyperactivity. Yeah. 2006, I believe, from memory, but I'm not sure. Yeah, so yeah, 10 or 15 years old.
Because one thing I'm really surprised about is that it doesn't integrate the narration about trauma.
Sorry?
One thing I'm surprised about is it doesn't integrate the narration about trauma.
Right.
Trauma informed.
Right.
And when you are thinking about the attentional balance, and you are saying we need to first be relaxed. Well, the problem for many people, or most people, maybe, is when you try to come in the present moment, then this trauma gets activated, and they cannot relax by just telling them, oh, just relax now.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question is, I don't see any mention about trauma in this article. And I think the reason is that, again, the article is to build bridges between psychology and Buddhism. So the field of, what's the word I'm looking for? The field within which they operate in psychology and Buddhism is not the same, but there is an overlap. And that's what this article is trying to point, that overlap and where it can join. Whereas I think trauma is really just in the field of psychology, within psychology. So I think that is where it's addressed, of course, and the therapies within psychology, whereas Buddhism in the domain of psychology. And so therefore, I think it's very important if people have really much more psychological issues like trauma and so forth, that not to just jump into Buddhist practices, which are not really specifically geared for that. Because again, if you just do mindfulness with trauma without having something around it, it could get much worse. You could go tip over the edge. So that's why I think it's important that we understand that. Otherwise, again, Buddhist practice is not geared towards that. So we, like sometimes what I understand is that in the field of psychology, we're trying to bring people up to the sort of normal level of mental health if they're below that through trauma and all these other shadow and psychosis and so forth. And then Buddhism assumes they're sort of roughly there, and then you can go further. And so that's where this article is addressing that middle band, whereas things like this, I think, fall really purely within the area of psychology. That's anyway my understanding. Sorry? Oh, you mean he wants to ask it directly? Oh, okay. Okay. I have to put my...
Can I speak up, Glenn?
Okay, yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful talk. And, it was such a good pulse check for me. How am I responding to the couple of challenging situations that I'm going through in my life? So what I wanted to ask you was, if I were to make a little framework using my pen and a paper to make notes that I am responding well to the situation in my life, keeping these 4 parameters that you walked us through, from the well-being aspects of attentional, cognitive, emotional, and the first one, I'm forgetting the key word. Motivational, right? So is there something that I can really do every morning to check on myself and make sure that I am responding in the right manner? Because I could be flipping or losing one of the well-being aspects out of the 4. Is this something that I can do on a daily basis from a regular practice point of view?
Yeah. So the question is this something that in a practical way you can do on a daily basis, is to have this sort of checklist of these 4 areas? Absolutely. I mean, like when we wake up in the morning, to check our motivation, what is our motivation for the day? Are we really, do we have reality-based aspirations for striving for our own happiness and others' happiness? Is that what is our direction for the day? And then just, again, also just check in terms of our attentional level. Are we sort of agitated? Are we dull? Are we focused? And then, again, the wisdom and the compassion side of things, that really we can see, what is our motivation here? Is our motivation one of compassion for myself and others or not? And then, look at very clearly what we're faced with and make sure that we're seeing it accurately through the wisdom, that we're not making sure that we're not projecting things onto what we perceive in front of us. So yes, I mean, I think if we have this 4-point checklist, and then we get really in the habit of, using that in all of our interactions, then yes, I think we're putting ourselves in a good stead for the day and for our own future well-being and others' well-being as well as our own.
And if I extend this to a little difficult situation in life, let's say you're having a court battle with someone and you have an opponent who's not your well-wisher, and you are trying to live a life and make sure there is peace and there is some kind of outcome or settlement or outcome through the judiciary process. You are confused. Sometimes you are confused because should we live with compassion and empathetic joy until the outcome is achieved? Or should we go through the pain or not feel the pain? It can be confusing in the difficult moments in your life, especially when things are completely not in your control. Any views on that?
Yeah. So the question is, I think, if we're faced with very heavy difficulties in our life, how to do this? And again, I think it's important because, and this, I think you've touched on a point here, is that often when people try to be compassionate in these difficult situations, then sort of wisdom sometimes goes out the window and they just allow themselves to be taken advantage of by others, whether it's in a court system or whatever. So if we have the compassion and motivation, we need to make sure that we've always got the wisdom with it in making those difficult decisions in everything we do in our life. And there is no book you can go to that says, this is the thing you need to do, because every situation is unique. And we evaluate every situation on its own merit, and then using the best compassion we have, the most wisdom we have. And of course, we can ask for some advice from others who may be more knowledgeable in these situations as well, for advice. But then we make a decision, and sometimes we make a mistake, and not to beat ourselves up if we make a mistake, because we will make mistakes, but then the key is then to learn from that mistake and move forward from that. So, I mean, that's all we can do. If we have best possible motivation of compassion, we use whatever wisdom we have, and we move forward. Demanding that we make the right decision, we'll get paralyzed, and sometimes not making a decision is the worst decision. So again, there's no thing. That's all we can do. If we can use these 4 elements to inform us of our decision-making process, that's all all we can do. And then we just, like I said, whenever we make a mistake, we learn from that, we move forward.
Thank you.
Let's pick, because it's quite important and I think you might find it helpful. So here is a specific example of cognitive imbalance called cognitive fusion. And I'll explain what that is shortly. And it really, I think, affects us, most of us in the modern world. And so if we understand it, we can overcome this type of cognitive imbalance, and thereby improve ourselves and then also help the people around us. So 2 questions here. Why do we get angry with others who behave badly? And where does low self-esteem and self-hatred come from? Because both of those, that seems very sort of almost epidemic in the modern world. And I think both of those questions can be answered with this idea of cognitive fusion. So let's have a look at that. First, now the correct perspective is, if someone's behaving badly, is to simply acknowledge and see there's a person doing or engaging in a harmful or bad behavior. That's the correct perspective. But often we don't have that perspective. Often our perspective is there's a bad person, horrible person, nasty person, evil person. So what we've done there is we have stuck the person and the behavior together as one thing. We've fused person and behavior together. We've made them one thing. In psychology, this is called cognitive fusion. Now, this is a false, invalid perspective, because there are 2 things here. Person and behavior are not the same thing. But if we do this cognitive fusion, and we do it a lot in the modern world, particularly our language supports this, is we're in trouble if we do this cognitive fusion. Because in any given situation, we've got 2 choices: accept or reject. And generally, if someone's behaving badly, we reject. And it's the behavior we don't like, that's what we reject. But if we've stuck the bad behavior to the person, we direct the rejection directly to the person. And so we reject the person, we attack the person, we get angry at the person. Because actually it's their behavior that is not okay, not the person, the behavior. But then the other option is that we don't want to really attack the person. We want to be accepting of the person. But then if we try to accept the person with cognitive fusion, because we've stuck the bad behavior to the person, we end up also accepting their bad behavior. So this is really the 2 choices we've got with cognitive fusion: reject the person, attack the person, and or accept their bad behavior. Both of those not helpful. And it gets worse than that, because if we do this, then we end up judging and condemning the person. And then forgiveness and compassion becomes very difficult, because having forgiveness and compassion to a bad person feels like what we're saying is what you did is okay. Because we want to have compassion for the person, not the behavior. We want to be accepting of the person, not the behavior. But trying to have compassion or forgiveness for a bad person feels like that. And we often even say they don't deserve forgiveness or compassion because there's just such a horrible, nasty, bad person. Cognitive fusion. And then even worse than that, we end up with a fixed, biased view of that person. They're a bad person, and bad people don't do good things, which means if they happen to do something good, we'll brush it off and say, well, they didn't really mean it because they're just a horrible person. And then it leads to conflict because, you know, they're the bad people over there. We're the good people over here. Let's get rid of those bad people over there. So it ends up good versus bad, conflict. So what's the solution to all of this? Don't do cognitive fusion because it's a false, invalid perspective. Simply adopt the correct perspective, i.e. cognitive balance. So remember, cognitive balance is not about superimposing or distorting, and that's what we've done here with cognitive fusion. We've distorted, we've put them together and made them one thing. So if we can just see clearly, there is a person doing a bad action, then we can accept the person, i.e. have forgiveness and compassion for the person, and at the same time, not tolerate their negative behavior, reject their negative behavior, and help them to overcome that negative behavior. So instead of judging the person, we evaluate behavior. And then compassion becomes more easy as well. And then we end up with a balanced view of that person. And instead of conflict, good versus bad, cooperation, because we're all people who want to be happy and sometimes do good things, sometimes do bad things. So let's help if someone does some bad, including ourselves. And so we cooperate, we can help. So that's, I think, one of the main reasons we get angry is because we do this cognitive fusion. So that's cognitive imbalance. So cognitive balance, if we just see, as the article is saying, if we just see reality as it is without projecting, superimposing, or distorting, then we will more easily and instinctively have compassion. So if we avoid the cognitive fusion, you will find that instead of instinctively getting angry at someone who's behaving badly, you'll instinctively start to have compassion for them. But at the same time, not tolerate their negative behavior. Where does low self-esteem and self-hatred largely reason? Because if we have done a harmful, bad action, the correct perspective is simply acknowledge, I have done this harmful action. That's the correct perspective. But often we don't adopt that perspective. Again, often we adopt the perspective, I'm a bad person, I'm a horrible person, nasty person. So again, we've done the cognitive fusion. We've fused ourselves with our behavior, made them one thing. So we end up again with the whole problem of accept and reject. And generally, again, here, we reject if we've done something harmful. But if we fuse the bad behavior to me, we reject ourselves. We attack ourselves. We get angry at ourselves. And that's where guilt comes from. If we've done something harmful and we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me, bad me. So guilt comes from a false, invalid perspective. We never need to feel guilty about anything. In fact, guilt is completely useless because all it does is it paralyzes us, makes us feel bad. It's not even addressing our bad behavior. And unfortunately, it seems to have been used by different religions and organizations over many centuries to have power over people. Because if you can give the guilt trip to someone, you paralyze them, you have power over them. And that's tragic. And again, worse than that, then likewise, if we do the cognitive fusion, we end up judging ourselves, criticizing ourselves, condemning ourselves, having self-hatred for ourselves because we're such a horrible person. And then we end up with low self-esteem because we have a fixed, biased view of ourselves. I'm just such a bad person. I'm no good. And again, the solution to this is don't do cognitive fusion because it's a false, invalid perspective. Simply adopt the correct perspective. I did this bad behavior. And then we can accept ourselves. We can forgive ourselves. We can have compassion for ourselves. We can reject our negative behavior. And this is the difference between regret and guilt. Guilt comes from cognitive fusion, completely useless. It just paralyzes us. Whereas regret comes from a valid perspective. Because if we've done something harmful and we regret, what are we focusing on? The bad behavior. We're regretting the behavior. And so then we can evaluate our behavior instead of criticizing ourselves. We can have forgiveness and compassion for ourselves, address our negative behavior and overcome that negative behavior. And then we can still have good self-esteem. So, it even is worse than this in our modern society. Not only are we really doing a lot of this cognitive fusion, but we have this obsessive focus on the negative in our modern world. And we know this well. If in any given day, we maybe do 95% good things, but 5% not so good, at the end of the day, what do we say? Oh God, I was such a horrible person today. Even though 95% of the things we did was good. And that's true. In fact, I saw they did a study in a big city in the US, and they asked people about whether the levels of violence and crime and so forth in the last 5 years had gone up, remained the same, or gone down. Most, if not, maybe not all, but the vast majority of them said definitely crime and all of these negative things in our city has got much worse in the last 5 years. Statistically, they had all gone down. But the media had pumped out this story that so much violence and crime, that's what people's perception was, focusing on the negative. So again, very important to focus on the positives as well as not doing the cognitive fusion. So here, this is cognitive balance training to avoid cognitive fusion. But remember, we need to practice the emotional balance. What was one of the key elements in emotional balance? Empathetic joy, focusing on our positive aspects of ourselves and others. So if we do that and not do this cognitive fusion, I think you'll find you'll have good self-esteem. You won't have low self-esteem, self-hatred. And at the same time, if you are engaging in any negative behavior, you won't tolerate that. You regret it. You work to overcome it. So this is the solution. Because unfortunately, some modern therapies, because this low self-esteem is sort of epidemic, unfortunately, some modern therapies trying to overcome that are still stuck in cognitive fusion. Because sometimes they ask you to focus on the fact that you're not a bad person. In fact, you're a good person. You're a good person. Just reinforce that you're a good person. Not so useful, because that's still cognitive fusion. Because if you reinforce that and you really believe it, you might think two things might happen. One is you go, oh yeah, I am really a good person. In fact, I'm better than everyone else. I'm special. I'm better than everyone else. So that's not good. And the other one is then that, well, I'm a good person. I can do whatever I want. No problems. I'm a good person, And so then maybe become unethical. So the solution is not to flip from I'm a bad person to I'm a good person. Simply acknowledge any bad behavior, regret it, not identify with it, and then also focus on the good actions. We must focus on the good actions to balance and be happy about doing good things, but not I'm a wonderful person, but rather I did a wonderful thing. Let's keep doing that action. Because if you just think I'm a wonderful person, might get a big head, ego trip, and then think we're better than everyone else. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. We've got a few minutes left for any questions. So does anyone have any questions about that, particularly that? Sure. Correct. Habits. Correct. Yeah. So that's a very good question. She said that, well, maybe it's a bit unrealistic to think if I just start thinking this other way, things will change. And it's because, unfortunately, again, we are literally being programmed to go down the way of cognitive fusion since we're this high. And that's actually very unfortunate. I mean, maybe probably unintentionally by parents, but maybe by some other organizations, maybe more intentionally, because if you can put the guilt trip on them, you've got power over people. And so that's tragic. So yes, it's been inground in our mind since we're this high. And it seems like in modern society, it's even programmed more than was earlier in earlier generations, in earlier cultures. But what we see here is that we can change. Can we change overnight? Probably not. But if we start to focus on each one of these 4 areas of mental balance, then we can slowly change. And you will find that if we start initially it'll be difficult to do this, what we're suggesting. But then if we really persist with that, I think you'll find it becomes more automatic. It becomes more instinctive. But if we don't train it continually, then it won't become a habit. Because if we can make that a habit, we're replacing the old habit. It will take time, but our old habit is just harming us and the people around us. So if we have the motivational balance, the aspiration to overcome that, and then we can focus on these attentional, because again, if we don't have attentional balance, as you probably rightly said, before you know it, it's already reacted, no? Because it's very quick. But actually there's a little window of opportunity from when a sort of stimulus arises until we react. But if we don't do the attentional balance training, we won't be able to catch that. And so you're right, we're really programmed to react based on our old habits. So to start to overcome those old habits, first we have to have the aspiration to do that through the motivational balance. Then we cultivate some attention skills so that when this habit starts to arise, we go, oh, hang on, don't think bad person, think person doing bad behavior. And then that's then cognitive training. And then together with that, we can work on the emotional balance so that instead of getting angry, we can have more compassion for ourselves and others. So if we work on those four elements, even though this is really quite strongly programmed into us since we're very young, we can change that. But it'll take time, but every little step we do will be an improvement, you know? Yeah.
Not wanting to move towards thinking you're a good person. And I was just wondering because, like, my understanding in the case of the was that in Buddhist psychology, that essentially the kind of mental afflictions would be the powers that they were basically good nature. That's how I understood it.
Correct.
I suppose, to my mind, that kind of pride that we're talking about, overreacting and good and bad, would be just another one of the
Correct, yeah. So I think he was saying that, you know, this sort of flipping over to sort of I'm good sort of thing. In Buddhism, of course, we talk about that pure nature, and sometimes we talk about Buddha nature and so forth. But again, it's our nature. You know, it's not us, it's our nature. So, yeah, because we have a nature, we're not the nature. So basically, to avoid, I mean, cognitive fusion is wrongly identifying ourselves with something that we're not. And in the example we were giving here, we're wrongly identifying ourselves with our behavior. You know, we have a certain behavior. If we have a certain behavior, we can't be behavior. If we have a certain habit, we're not the habit. If we have a certain personality, we are not the personality, and so on. But we wrongly identify ourselves with things which we have as being us. So like often, you know, people who have a strong habit of getting angry, what do they say? I'm an angry person. That's me. You got to accept that. So again, basically by doing that fusion, you've basically said, there you go, anger, you're the boss, away you go, because that's me. I'm an angry person. And if you think like that, you'll feel like I'm stuck, because you maybe have a strong habit of being angry. But if you do that identification, you'll wallow in that. You'll think, no hope, because I'm just an angry person. I've been that since I was very young. That's me, no hope of change. But if you just think, I have a habit of a strong habit of getting angry, already it feels not like there's a bit of a distance there. You know, I have a habit of getting angry. And if you think like that, well, then you think, well, hang on, you can change habits. Might be not easy, but we can change habits, you know. And so then we have a starting point to work with. The Buddha nature, sometimes when people identify with that, I'm enlightened, I'm special, you listen to me because I'm enlightened, and then grabs hold of that and we become completely delusional. And you could become what's called a spiritual ego. And spiritual ego is one of the worst. So spiritual ego often comes from wrongly identifying with some of these positive qualities that we are wanting to develop. But the ego latches onto them and appropriates them. And we see horrible examples of that in the modern world. Exploitation of others, financial, psychological, sexual exploitation.
Glenn, I have a question. May I ask you?
Sorry, wait on. So we've
Am I audible?
Sorry, yes?
Yeah, Glenn. Hi. It was a lovely session. Had one question.
Sure.
See, I have been experimenting with mindfulness, a bit of motivational reading, and when I come to your talk, I see the interrelation of the four things, and I don't know where I am. And when you talk about mindfulness having a negative impact, I get a little confused and worried. So how do I know how you're going about it? How do we structure it? Do I have somewhere where the principles, which you say motivational as a basics, can be learned through an online course or something?
So the question is, I think, we talked about the importance of these four types of mental balance, and this will be the last question because we've run out of time now. The importance of practicing all these four, but, how do we know where we are in this and what do we need to emphasize and so forth? And this is why, in spiritual systems like Buddhism, we have that structure that's very clear. But within that structure, I think it's very helpful to have a qualified teacher who can really see you as an individual, where you're at and what you really need to emphasize. Because I'm not suggesting that, with these four elements, that every day we need to do 25% of each one of them. I mean, some days we may need to do 50% attentional and then the other three together 50, or other days maybe we need to do more motivational, and other days so forth. But how to make that balance is where, particularly in Buddhism, a qualified teacher can be very helpful to fine tune that balance. But what I'm suggesting, or that the article's suggesting, is that we need to make sure that we're covering all four bases in whatever we do.
Thank you.
That's all. Okay. So that's it. So we've run out of time now. So let's finish there. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming to this talk and those of you online. And this talk has been recorded and we will make that available, and you'll be able to find that through, I think, the Tushita Facebook, and also probably from my website as well. So thank you all for coming. Hope you got something out of the talk. Thank you very much.
Especially on this auspicious occasion. Thank you so much for accepting to give this talk. And I think many people benefited also online. So, and we have the recordings. So if you wanted to, refer to the recordings, it was live on YouTube and we put it in a folder. Yeah. On our website, there will be like a recording for. Thank you so much, everybody. And at 5 o'clock, we have Medicine Buddha Puja. It's in English for around an hour. And at 7 o'clock, we have light offering. So if you wanted to join, that is, you're most welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.